So, as we enter Chapter 7, we see that the topic of this chapter is cholinergic drugs. But cholinergic is a term that has some ambiguity associated with it. What do you mean, cholinergic? Where are we? Are we in skeletal muscle? That would obviously be the somatic nervous system. Are we in the ganglia of the ANS? Be they sympa or parasympathetic, there's a nicotinic receptor there in the ganglia, right? The first fiber comes in, the second cell sends a fiber, but in that ganglia there's a receptor on that second cell called the nicotinic neuronal receptor. That's a cholinergic receptor. And then obviously throughout the parasympathetic into target tissues we have muscarinic receptors. And then last but not least, even in sympathetic man, right, when we're under some kind of physical stress, we're sweating, and so we have a cholinergic receptor in the sympathetic nervous system at the thermoregulatory sweat glands. So we had talked about that last class. So cholinergic drugs are going to be those drugs which can affect one or more of those receptors. So if you look at the slide and you look at the very middle of the slide, the word receptors is there. And so which receptors? Those of the muscarinic type, which we see in nerves, or in the heart, or in smooth muscle of various places, or the glands, or the endothelium of blood vessels, right? Or are we talking about nicotinic receptors, in which case we can see them in the ganglia, which are the neuronal type, or in the neuromuscular junction, which are the muscle type. And so acetylcholine is able to activate both muscarinic and nicotinic in the various locations, right? It's nature's ligand. It's put there to do that job. Okay. But acetylcholine has a lot of limitations. It's not a particularly good drug. It's a wonderful nature's ligand. But it's a kind of a poor drug. And why is it poor? Because acetylcholine is rapidly inactivated in the blood. And the blood has to carry it somewhere, right? The blood has to take it somewhere. But the blood has what we call non-specific esterases. The blood has lots of non-specific esterases. And why are they there? Well, we don't exactly know. But one of the thoughts is that your blood is carrying these esterases to prevent viral attack of your body. Because as you know, DNA is made up of phosphodiester bonds, and DNA viruses would be chopped up by esterases, right? So maybe that's one reason. But whatever the reason may be, acetylcholine is a poor drug because even if you give it parenterally, it doesn't last very long, right? Seconds. And so drugs have been designed to extend the duration of action because otherwise we couldn't use acetylcholine. It wouldn't be practical. So acetylcholine is a great nature's ligand, but it's not a good drug because its pharmacokinetics limit it. And in fact, we talked about duration of action, but it's also poorly absorbed. So got to use something else, right? So chapter 6 is about cholineceptor stimulants, things that cause the acetylcholine receptors to be activated. And that general class is also vague. What do you mean stimulants of cholineceptors? How do we get stimulants? Stimulants can be direct by the drug that we're giving a patient. We bind directly to a receptor of the muscarinic or nicotinic variety and stimulate it. Or we might have indirect acting drugs. And this is a very key concept, so you want to invest this couple of minutes to understand the difference. An indirect acting drug is one which doesn't stimulate the receptor by itself. It has a different target. The target of the drugs that I'm pointing to here in the indirect acting drugs is an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase. If a drug blocks acetylcholine esterase, then acetylcholine stays high in the synaptic cleft. It doesn't get degraded as readily as it otherwise would. So think back to the cholinergic synapse, right? Acetylcholine gets bumped into the synaptic cleft, right? And some of it diffuses down and binds to receptors on target cells. But when the acetylcholine falls off the receptor, how is it inactivated? It doesn't go in through reuptake 1 to the presynaptic cell. It doesn't go into the postsynaptic cell through reuptake 2, like norepinephrine does. We talked about that, right? Okay. So acetylcholine doesn't have those kinds of things that happen to it. It gets chopped. It gets chopped by acetylcholinesterase that's in the cleft, bound to the postsynaptic effector cell, that's the target tissue. But if you block that enzyme, what you've done is you've kept acetylcholine levels high in the cleft so that it can bind its own receptor more than it otherwise would. Right? You exaggerate its own effect. So indirect acting drug has as its target something other than the receptors, but the consequence is it increased acetylcholine, and so the acetylcholine binds to its own receptors more than it otherwise would. You see the difference? So indirect acting drugs cause acetylcholine to go up by blocking a totally different target, an enzyme. Remember, that's one of the choices on the, well, I don't know if you got that particular written form test, but one of my questions was, what are the 4 general categories of proteins that can act as a receptor? Regulatory protein, structural protein, transport protein, enzyme. So here, indirect acting are acting in an enzyme, blocking the enzyme, acetylcholine levels stay higher than they should, and we can get acetylcholine response. Now, one thing I'll say here, which I could say anywhere really in this talk, is that, and I'll just draw a little arrow here. Under prolonged acetylcholine stimulation, the nicotinic receptor desensitizes. So under prolonged acetylcholine stimulation, the nicotinic receptor desensitizes. What other receptor desensitizes that we talked about in this class? The beta adrenergic receptor, right? In prolonged stimulation, Bark kinase gets activated, we get phosphorylation of the tail, the receptor gets desensitized. So the drug is bound to receptor, but the response stops. That's desensitization, right? And it's temporal. Well, if the nicotinic receptor desensitizes, it stops responding to agonists. And the kind of nicotinic receptor that desensitizes is in the neuromuscular junction. It's the one that's part of the somatic nervous system. Right? So even though this unit is called the ANS, like some of what we talk about is the somatic nervous system. And so prolonged stimulation of nicotinic receptor in the somatic nervous system causes this kind of response. It's weird. Watch it. Contraction, 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 desensitization, 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 paralysis. The muscle just stops contracting, even though the drug is bound to the receptor. So back in chapter 2, I said there's 2 types of receptors that we know about that desensitize. One is the beta adrenergic receptor. Another is the nicotinic receptor. In fact, there are others, but for the moment, we'll speak to these 2. The beta adrenergic receptor and the nicotinic receptor in the skeletal muscle. So, if that receptor in skeletal muscle stays on too long, the tissue becomes non-responsive to the agonist. The tissue becomes paralyzed. So sometimes these are called paralytic agents. Okay, so in the world of nicotinic muscle type blockers, we have those which depolarize and then inhibit. We have those which just plainly inhibit. So what we have are called depolarizing blockers, which is a paradox, right? How can you depolarize and block? Depolarize in muscle means contract, right? So depolarizing blockers, first they contract, then they relax, versus just non-depolarizing blockers, which are always blocked. And that'll be a subject of a short YouTube video I'll post sometime. All right, so if I ask you which receptor in the cholinergic pathway can be desensitized, you would say to me the nicotinic muscle type. Good. And that has an official name. It has a special name. It's called depolarizing blockade. So first the muscle contracts and then it's blocked. Okay, so I like this slide because really it summarizes the entire chapter right here on the table. Direct acting versus indirect acting, structural classes, the different receptors, different target tissues, and so on. So first let's talk about the indirect acting. The indirect acting are going to be those which inhibit the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. And acetylcholinesterase hydrolyzes acetylcholine back to precursor molecules that are not active. Right? So acetylcholinesterase is present in the cholinergic synapse, and its job is to shut off acetylcholine signal. So we had exocytosis, we had a release, we had some kind of response, and now the cholinesterase is cleaving the acetylcholine and the response goes away. Right? That's how it usually works. But if you block this enzyme, the acetylcholine persists in the cleft. And so it can repeatedly stimulate. And so there are two types of inhibitors in this class. Reversible, which are competitive inhibitors. And then we have the irreversible inhibitors. Now, this class of irreversible inhibitors, I would just put a little star by them, and I would say irreversible, comma, but not right away. Irreversible, comma, but not right away. And so what that means is this is a kind of a special type of covalent modifier. The covalent modifier becomes a covalent modifier through the process of metabolism and activation. So the organophosphates in this class have to be metabolized to a form that then covalently bonds. So there's a time gap between exposure to a irreversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and when it actually becomes final, right? The near final event. And I'll talk about that in a moment when we get back into this. So for the moment, we have two types, reversible and irreversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. On the other hand, we have direct agonists of acetylcholine receptors, direct agonists, and they bind to and directly activate the receptor. But what receptor are we talking about? Well, it depends on the drug. If it's acetylcholine, then it's both nicotinic and muscarinic receptors, wherever the body releases acetylcholine. But if it's a certain drug might prefer nicotinic receptors to muscarinic. Another drug might prefer muscarinic to nicotinic, and so on. And so we're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail as we move forward today as well. However, some of the direct-acting nicotinic stimulators cause depolarization blockade, which is a type of desensitization where the receptor stops responding, the tissue relaxes. That's paradox, unexpected, unusual, but yet real. So the first type of directly acting cholinomimetics are the choline esters. The choline esters look like acetylcholine. So if you look in the upper left here where we're pointing to right now, right, we see acetylcholine. And maybe we couldn't draw it from our memory, but we look at this structure and we see the choline moiety, okay, where we have a positively charged quaternary nitrogen, which is a real bummer for absorption. Right? That's a real bummer for absorption. Is that thing crossing cell membranes and getting into the cytoplasm and then binding to some transcriptional regulator and going to the nucleus? No. Right? This thing can only work on the outside of a cell where you have the watery environment, but it's not going to cross any membrane because it's positively charged. It's not going to happen. And there's no transporter for it on the cell membrane. There is a transporter for it in the vesicle when it's made in the exosome, but I digress. Right? So acetylcholine has a choline portion, which is this part of it is this positively charged nitrogen. And it has an acetyl portion, right? CH3 C double bond O, an acetate group, acetylcholine. And so if we now look at the structure called acetylcholine that's made to us from using choline and acetate by the enzyme choline acetyltransferase, right, in axon terminus, part of chapter 6 stuff, right? If we look at this, we see that the resulting structure is an ester, CH3 C double bond O O R, right? That's an ester group. And so this drug or this ligand is a substrate for esterases, enzymes that cleave ester bonds, right? So if we look at acetylcholine, we realize that this is a substrate for acetylcholine esterase. So, and we know that that's pretty rapidly inactivated, right? So we have to do something to change this to make it more useful as a drug from the outside to the in. From the in to the in, you can't beat it, right? From the in to the in, nature's ligand works the best. But from the out to the in, from the doctor to the patient, you can't mimic it. It doesn't work that way, right? You can't use it itself. You have to mimic it to have it work. And so if we take acetylcholine and the medicinal chemists played with its structure, what they realized was that if you methylate it, and that'll be the next slide, right? If you methylate it, as indicated here by these red circles, you make the compound more muscarinic in its pharmacology. So methylation makes it muscarinic. Methylation makes it muscarinic. Right? So if you look at a drug like methacholine, or you look at a drug like bethanachol, we have a methylated form of acetylcholine, which is more muscarinic in nature. If you keep looking down this set of choline esters, you might notice that carbachol and bethanachol are not esters. Right? We don't have a CH3 here, but rather we have a carbamate, right? This is a carbamic acid structure. We have carbamates here. So these are not substrates for acetylcholinesterase. So do you think that they're longer acting or shorter acting or no change compared to acetylcholine? Longer acting, right? So drugs like carbachol and bethanachol are longer acting acetylcholine mimics. But bethanachol is mostly muscarinic, where carbachol is non-selective, with like nicotinic and muscarinic reception. Okay? And so, if you were to look at these drugs now, of them all, probably the only ones you'll see typically are bethanachol and carbachol, right? And they're usually used topically to treat glaucoma. So, what can we say about these modifications and the pharmacology of these? Well, the modifications result in negligible susceptibility to cholinesterase, right? So we make those esters, we make them amide bonds, then all of a sudden we've lost susceptibility longer acting. If we now have methylated form of acetylcholine, like bethanachol and methacholine, look at what happens to selectivity at nicotinic receptor. We lose it, right? And so the drug becomes more muscarinic in its action. Okay? Now, those are the choline esters, and the choline esters carry full positive charge, and they're susceptible to esterase, right? Of course, if we make them amides, then they're longer acting, like carbachol and bethanachol. If we look at the alkaloid, remember the word alkaloid means a compound originally identified in a plant that contains at least one nitrogen atom. A compound originally identified in a plant that contains at least one nitrogen atom. So if we look at this compound, muscarine, we see that it's got a quaternary nitrogen. It kind of looks a lot like acetylcholine over here. And what kind of receptor does muscarine stimulate? selectively. Muscarinic receptor. So in fact, back in the day when we had Schmeideberg around, right, when we started to go into the 1900s with people like John Jacob Abel, we didn't know the nature of receptors. We didn't know that these were 7-trans membrane spanning or that these were pentameric structures. We didn't know that. That all came later in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But what we did know is that certain drugs had a preferential selectivity at doing certain things. Right? So muscarine, if you expose an animal to it, would cause the animal to salivate, it would slow down the animal's heart rate, it would do certain things that we now associate as muscarinic receptor driven. Right? So the idea came out that there must be receptors that bind to muscarine that are different than receptors that bind to nicotine. Right? Because when you would put nicotine into an animal, you'd see that the skeletal muscle would contract. If you did prolonged exposure, the muscle would paralyze. If you did polarizing blockade, you got a very different response. So pharmacologists said, well, there must be nicotinic receptors out there. So while they both are able to respond to acetylcholine, there must be at least two broad types because we have those which respond to nicotine, we have those which respond to muscarine. So these were the first compounds that were used to kind of characterize the different subtypes. Later we found out that M1 and M2 and M3, there's neuronal and there's muscle type of nicotine. Okay? So we have muscarine, we have nicotine. If we compare nicotine to muscarine, which of the two do you think is more able to be absorbed? And why? Who says that muscarine is better absorbed than nicotine? No, right? Because it's got a full positive charge on it. Right? But nicotine is actually a neutral compound. And which plant does nicotine come out of? Don't chew tobacco plant, right? The tobacco plant. Right? My chemistry lab partner in college, her father had a huge tobacco farm in southern Maryland. And I never realized how wealthy she was. You know, we were chemistry lab mates, you know. And she was a wonderful chemistry lab partner. But I got invited to her wedding shortly after graduating. I walk into this wedding, it's like every table had a tobacco plant on it, instead of like flower, right? Had a tobacco plant on it. There was like a life-size sculpture of a husband and wife, ice sculpture with the light shining on it and it was rotating. Right? I didn't know where I was. I was like, well, yeah. And then I found out that my chemistry lab partner's dad sold tobacco to one of the rivals of Marlboro. And so he did very well. And anyway, the tobacco plant was the source of this compound, and obviously it's one of the pharmacologically active compounds that have people smoke, right? What does nicotine do to the smoker? Right? It makes some smokers will say, I have to have a cigarette first thing in the morning. Why? It wakes them up. Why does it wake them up? It has nicotinic action. What does nicotinic action do at, for example, neuronal receptor in the ganglia? So here's a sympathetic ganglia, right? First fiber comes out of the spinal cord, forms a synapse, releases acetylcholine, binds to a nicotinic receptor on that second cell, which releases the fiber to the heart. What happens to the heart when the sympathetic ganglia when it's stimulated? It speeds up, right? What happens to the blood vessels? They constrict. So what does nicotine do to your heart rate? Increases your heart rate, gets your blood pumping. Okay. Some people who smoke, right, they get a lot of fluid in their mouth, saliva, right? They get that saliva mouth, right? So nicotine is doing those things. Of course, nicotine, what do you think? You think it might have a chance to cross the blood-brain barrier, or it's just kind of not charged there? Right? So you know that nicotine crosses the blood-brain barrier. Why do you know that? Because people can become blank to it, addicted to it, right? People get addicted to it. It can have central effects. It can affect your mood, right? There are nicotinic receptors in the CNS. Can give you a feeling of being awake, right? So, people smoke because they like, I guess, those things. But then there's a lot of other nasty stuff in the tobacco plant. When you burn it, it gets formed, like polycyclic hydrocarbon or tar that can cause lung cancer. So there's obviously the negative side, right? But is it a good idea for people with hypertension to smoke? No, I heard no. Why? Increases heart rate, increases vasoconstriction, increases blood pressure, right? Now, we're not talking about an increase like 30 points. Your blood pressure ain't going to go up to like 190 over 110, but it might be 5 or 7 points. It might take a 130 over 70 up to a 140 over 89, which is getting there. Right? And then obviously, if you're already hypertensive and you're barely able to kind of manage your blood pressure, your average is like 140 over 95. Now you keep smoking, and maybe it's 150 over 100. You don't want that chronically, right? The more it's like that, the more likely you're going to get, negative consequence of that. Right, so nicotine has some pharmacologic action. We know that from people who smoke. It's probably the reason why they smoke. And then there's all kinds of nasty stuff in cigarette smoke that can hurt you. But this one seems to be something that can wake you up, you get boost, or whatever you want to call it. But it also has the ability to, to suck you in, and then you become addicted to it. So we know it has central effects as well. All right, so now I think I've told you about that. And so now as a drug, so you might say, well, Dr. Gluck, that's the cigarette counter in the pharmacy. I work on the other counter. Right? I work on the medicine counter. I don't work on the cigarette counter. Do pharmacies still have cigarette counters? I used to work in a pharmacy and I had some cigarette counter. I don't know, job. So Chesterfield, Camel, Precious Moments, all that. After a year, they let me work behind the pharmacy counter and see things. But I know some of the chains are taking the cigarettes out. Yes, so that's progress. That's good. But nicotine is also available as a drug, right? You see it as a patch, you see it as a gum, right? And so why would you ever give it to somebody if it can do these things? And the answer is you're trying to get people who are addicted to stop taking it, right? So the physician will kind of estimate how much nicotine they get each day from their smoking, and then try to replace that with the daily patch dose that distributes the amount you normally get to smoke. And right there, it's hard to beat because a lot of people like the compulsory action of just lifting it up and moving it. It gives them some kind of comfort, right? Some kind of comfort in the behavior. It's like, why do I eat at 11:30 when I'm not hungry? There's just something about the behavior that calms you down. Sympathetic man needs to go away, and digesting parasympathetic man needs to come back. So I'm going to eat, right? Something in the behavior. So the thing is, people who take nicotine gum or nicotine patch, the idea is to do a bait and switch. Here's how much they normally get. Let's switch them onto this, and let's over time give them less and less and less until they have no more desire to smoke. And what do you know about success rates? 100% success, 50% success, not too successful. Maybe 20% success rate. No? So it's hard because of the central effects and the sucking you in, properly nicotine. Okay? But it is available as a drug, and the idea there is to wean the patient off the drug until they don't crave it anymore. Does that make sense? Do a lot of people buy that stuff? Do you need a prescription for that? I don't know. Alright, so that's the approach. Now, pilocarpine is a neutral compound, right? So it's absorbable by mouth. And pilocarpine is a drug used to treat glaucoma. Have you ever seen pilocarpine drops, eye drops, in your pharmacy? Some of you say yes, right? And so pilocarpine is going to work to cause a phenomenon in the eye called meiosis. And so meiosis causes your iris to pull away from the cornea and causes your pupil to get tiny. Right? And so that allows increased flow of fluid in your eye out. So I have a slide on this coming. So for the moment, just say has usefulness in glaucoma, but also has usefulness in other situations where you want to stimulate muscarinic receptors. Like, for example, there are certain patients who don't make a lot of saliva, and it becomes difficult for them to eat, right? So imagine if you had no saliva, how pleasant eating might make you feel. Right? And so these patients that I'm thinking of are patients who have been irradiated due to radiation therapy, cancer. Right? And patients who get their head or their neck irradiated, oftentimes their salivary glands shut down. And so one way to stimulate them back is to give them a mouth spray of pilocarpine. Have any of you ever seen the mouth spray of pilocarpine? Spray in your mouth, it binds to the receptors on your salivary glands, and the salivary glands produce saliva. Right? So that's going to be the cancer patient who's gone under radiation of the head or neck. They can take pilocarpine mouth spray. We understand the pharmacodynamics, it makes sense, it causes salivary glands to release saliva. There are some people who are born with a genetic deficiency in making saliva or in making sweat. So there's a very rare syndrome called Sjogren's syndrome. So write it down because I don't have any chalk today. Sjogren's. Sjogren's. Sjogren. It's a Swedish thing. Swedish. And so it seems to run in families of Nordic descent, and due to genetic polymorphism that causes their salivary glands to be underactive. So people with Sjogren's syndrome can take mouth spray of pilocarpine and make saliva again. Okay. So those are some uses for pilocarpine. So it's an old drug. It's definitely not used as much for glaucoma as it used to be because of other drugs that have now come out. But it's still there for that purpose. It has a few other purposes. And its action is due to muscarinic stimulation. So let's predict the systemic effects of pilocarpine. If you took it as a tablet by mouth, which is also out there, you could get that drug. They usually do. So what kind of systemic effects are you going to see? Let's say on the eye, meiosis, right? Going to open up the angle, outflow, aqueous humor, that's good. How about the heart? The heart might be going to go fast or go slow. You're stimulating the M2. Slow. You're going to get Tom Brady cardia. And Tom Brady cardia. Yeah. Low heart rate. Actually, he gives me tachycardia because I'm a Jet fan, and he just ruins it for me every year. Yeah. I think he's kind of a jerk what he did. In his personal life, but I don't know all the factors. But other than that, he gives me tachycardia, but Tom Brady cardia is with pilocarpine. How about your gut? So is pilocarpine systemic effect diarrhea or constipation? Diarrhea. Very good, right? Because muscarinic receptors in the gut stimulate peristalsis. How about the lungs? Is pilocarpine going to help you breathe better or breathe harder? More difficult to breathe. Muscarinic receptor activation in the bronchiolar smooth muscle causes constriction, so it's harder to breathe. It can also cause increased secretion of fluid. Right? So sometimes those are called bronchosecretions. So your bronchi, right? They have a lining to them of a mucus-like fluid that catches particles that you inhale. Right? So you're walking down the street and the MTA bus just lets out a cloud of smoke right in front of your face. And you breathe it in because where else are you going to get your oxygen from? Right? So there's particles in there that are sticking to the walls of your bronchi, and then you got that mucociliary escalator that brings it back up and then you spit them out. Right? So those are the kinds of systemic things that you might see if you give pilocarpine by mouth, orally, right, as a capsule or a tablet. Now, let's say we'll go back to the eye drop example. So why would I give it topically instead of a tablet? What am I trying to prevent? First pass, maybe, but how about systemic effects that I don't need? I don't want bradycardia. I don't want diarrhea. I don't want any of that stuff. I just want my glaucoma to go away. So I give some topical. Does that mean you get absolutely zero absorption systemically? No, you might get some systemic absorption, and you might see some of those adverse effects. It shouldn't be as much as if you were taking it by mouth. Yeah? Okay. So when it comes to the alkaloids and the synthetic, so synthetic just means like Dr. Talili made it, or Dr. Korlapara made it, or Dr. Kwan made it in their lab. Isn't that so cool? You know, you walk by Dr. Korlapara's lab. I just made this thing, and it activated this receptor. I'm so excited. I'm excited for you too. Okay. So synthetic means you can make it in the lab. Alkaloid means you get it out of a plant. And then, of course, synthetic alkaloid means you just synthesize something you get from a plant without using the plant. Right? Any of you ever heard of the drug Taxol? It's an anti-cancer drug. It comes out of a tree called the yew tree, Y-E-W. And so it's a great anti-cancer drug, but the problem is it's a 42-step organic synthesis to produce it, right? So it's really hard to produce it synthetically. So they've made it easier than 42 steps, but originally the synthesis was 42 steps. And so synthetic compounds are sometimes easier to make than the plant, and sometimes they're not easier to make than the plant. Sometimes you need. But anyway, these compounds typically well absorbed. Otherwise, they have similar effects to other acetylcholine agonists. And where they differ is in their specificity for muscarinic or nicotinic receptors. Again, use, generally speaking, is limited to glaucoma or some rare situations like treating a radiation patient or treating somebody with a rare genetic syndrome. Ophthalmic uses. But anyway, understanding, for example, by the way, these receptors, right, that are being active in the eye, that are being active in the gut, that are being active in the GI tract, the reproductive tract, it's important because while the number of drugs you might see on this list is not very large compared to some of the antihypertensive, anti-diabetes, anti-thyroid, whatever drugs you see, many of the drugs that we dispense in pharmacies have what are called anticholinergic activity. So they cause things like dry mouth, they cause things like dry eye, they cause things like constipation, right? They may cause tachycardia. They have certain effects that can be defined as anticholinergic. So you might be giving a drug for condition X, which is unrelated to the ANS, but its anticholinergic action is showing itself in the ANS. So just to spend a little bit of time now on some of the organs and their responses, because if you understand the organs and their responses, then it becomes easy really to understand the drugs. Now, just FYI, I can set my alarm here. I'll go way over. I become completely dependent on my pedometer. I won't even go out anymore with the kids unless I turn my pedometer on. Well, that's true. But that's okay. At least, I'm trying. All right, so the organs, so the eye, right? In the eye, we've got a few muscles we need to think about. One of the muscles is the sphincter muscle of the iris, and the other is the ciliary muscle. Now, these muscles are going to be very useful in accommodation. And so accommodation means this. I can look at students in the last row of this class and focus on them, and I can look at students in the front row and focus on them. And my vision is not affected by whether I'm looking far away or I'm looking near. I'm looking far away or I'm looking near. When I go from looking far away to looking close, called accommodation. My eyes have to adjust rapidly to change the focus, right? So if you have a camera and you're trying to take a picture of something far away, it's going to take a second to focus, right? But your eye does it faster, so you can focus. And so these muscles are involved in accommodation, right? And so what happens if you dilate your pupils and you try to look at things that are close? Do they look crispy clear, or do they look fuzzy? Are you allowed to just drive home from the ophthalmologist's office with that dilated pupil? No. Why? Because your vision is disrupted, right? You can't accommodate it, right? So these muscles are involved in accommodation, and we're going to talk about them again a little later this morning when we talk about glaucoma and why cholinomimetics are effective against glaucoma. And then we're also going to talk about them in terms of vision in the next chapter. Now the heart we can kind of break down by the pacing of the heart, nodes, or the chambers of the heart. But no matter how you slice the pie, muscarinic receptor activation decreases the rate, negative chronotropy, decreases the contractile strength, negative inotropy. Okay, so the heart beats less intensely and less quickly. If we look at the blood vessels, now the blood vessel effects are somewhat confusing. So we're going to focus on dilation, okay? And the dilation is occurring not through actually receptors on the smooth muscle here, but rather through muscarinic receptors on endothelial cells. Muscarinic receptors on endothelial cells. I don't have any chalk here. So let's see if I can paint a visual picture. So if you imagine a blood vessel as having a layer of muscle, and then above that layer of muscle, closer to the lumen of the vessel, you have endothelial cells that line the inside. Right? Epithelial cells line my outside, endothelial cells line the lumens of things. So those endothelial cells have muscarinic receptors on their surface, M3. And when they're stimulated by acetylcholine, they release something called endothelial-derived relaxing factor, or nitric oxide, which propels itself to gas. It's kind of propels itself out of the endothelial cell into the smooth muscle. It's below it. Right, so the endothelial cell, one side of itself faces the lumen, the other side of itself faces the smooth muscle. So the nitric oxide just goes down to the smooth muscle relaxes. Right, so that's on the blood vessels, on arteries and veins, we see a relaxation or a dilation of blood vessels due to EDRF. High dose direct effect is in the lab. It's not in people. Okay, because in the lab you can strip away the endothelial cells, get a lot of acetylcholine and see constriction. Don't worry about that, because it's an artificial system. The natural system is EDRF release and vasorelaxation. Now, I don't know if I have a slide on that here. It's not on my list. So let me go along this line and have you write male reproductive organ. Male reproductive organ. In order for the male reproductive organ to sustain an erection, the muscle within it has to relax. Okay? So M3 receptors, when stimulated, cause the male reproductive organ to experience erection. What am I talking about? This very uncomfortable subject right now. Well, the reason why I'm talking about it is because some of the anticholinergic effects of drugs result in impotence. That's not a really good adverse effect, right? Right? So you might be taking a drug for X, and it's causing you impotence because it has anticholinergic activity in the male reproductive tract. Right, so one day you're going to come to a class in your curriculum called drug-induced disease. Disease is caused by drugs that are being used to treat other things, undesired events. So I guess under blood vessels here you can put male reproductive organ and M3 receptor and EDRF and erection. And those things can be blocked by anticholinergic drugs. Okay? In order for the male reproductive event, there needs to be erection, there needs to be ejaculation. So in the alpha blocker topic we get to next class, there are some drugs that can affect ejaculatory response. So there's two ways, unfortunately, to get sexual dysfunction in men. One is on erection, the other is on ejaculation. And so we'll discuss that again from an alpha receptor perspective. Here we're talking about erection. Okay, if we look at the lung, right, if we look at bronchial or smooth muscle, muscarinic receptors cause contraction. If we look at the bronchiolar glands that secrete that lubricating fluid, that mucus that lines the internal surface of the bronchi, we see that they're stimulated. So the bronchi constrict and the glands secrete things. So is it easier to breathe or harder to breathe when these receptors are stimulated? Harder to breathe, right? So a drug like pilocarpine could precipitate bronchospasm in an asthmatic patient. They already have a problem, right? So this can complicate their problem. Does that make sense? You give a drug that can cause bronchoconstriction to an asthmatic. Does that make any common sense to you? Is that a good idea? No. But sometimes a drug might have that effect. So keep that in mind. Now, obviously, we're only talking here about the acetylcholine responses. We know from table 6-3 that the bronchial smooth muscle can be innervated sympathetically, and beta-2 receptors can relax it on bronchodilation. That's the opposing mechanisms here, just focusing in on acetylcholine. But next class, we'll talk about norepinephrine. So really, this last 2 or 3 slides is just part of that table 6-3, kind of splattered up on the wall from the parasympathetic state. Only. There's really nothing new here. If we look at the GI tract, motility goes up, the sphincters relax, the glands secrete things to line the inside of the gut so that you don't get scraping or tearing or injury due to the mass of feces that's moving through. Right? So lubrication, protection. Right? So if the gut is motile, if there's peristalsis going on, then the sphincters have to be open. If the sphincters are closed and the gut's peristalsis, what happens? You get an unpleasant cramping feeling, right? An unpleasant feeling if the sphincters are closed and the gut's contracted. So usually the gut contracts, the sphincters open. The material flows through. Right, if we look at the urinary bladder, right, the detrusor muscle, the big muscle around the bladder, contracts, and the sphincters relax. Right, so the bladder contracts, the 2 sphincters open, and urine flows out. If we look at glands, be they sweat glands or salivary glands or lacrimal glands or nasopharyngeal glands, secretion. Okay, so this is sometimes why anticholinergic drugs cause dry mouth or dry eye. This is sometimes why anticholinergic drugs can affect the people who exercise, right? Can cause them to feel lousy because they're exercising and their sweat is impaired. Okay, so I'm saying things that pertain to the next chapter, but all in the context of what normally happens when the receptor is stimulated, and so if we block that, what happens? And so just to give a few examples back to the choline esters, if we look at methacholine or bethanechol, right, these are the methyl forms. We see mostly muscarinic action with little to no nicotinic action. And if these drugs are administered systemically, we'll see effects in the heart, in the GI tract, in the bladder. If they're administered topically, we'll see effects in the eye. And this is really why they're used for the eye, for glaucoma. Okay, so this is really just a reminder of the things we have talked about with choline. Looking at it from the lens of receptor selectivity. Is it muscarinic selective, or is it nicotinic selective? Or is it non-selective? And so now a little bit on the eye. Okay, if you're looking at the eye from the side profile, so like the person's ear would be here, the nose would be here, the mouth would be here, looking at the side of their head. This would be the cornea. And so this would be where the light comes in, right? And it comes in through your pupil, goes through the lens, which focuses in on something back here, which isn't pictured, called what? What nerve? What nerve picks up the light? Okay, and what's another name for that? Starts with R. The retina. That's the retina. So the light comes through the pupil, through the lens focuses in on the retina. Okay? So the retina is not drawn here, so just draw it somewhere. And so what normally happens is that the light comes through, stimulates the retina transduces it into vision that we see, right? The things we see. Well, let's talk a little bit about the structures of the eye. So the eye has a three-dimensional structure to it. It's a fluid-filled structure. Right? It's a bag of water. Right? So if the eye is made up of fluid, the fluid within the eye exerts pressure on the structures within the eye. Yes? So there's a fluid that bathes the eye, both on the internal side and on the external side. And the lacrimal gland is not pictured here, release that fluid that coats the outside. But anyway, if you look at what I'm pointing to here, this would be the iris. And the iris has a few functional units that we want to talk about. One of them is the tip of the iris. The tip of the iris has smooth muscle that's under alpha receptor regulation. But again, here we're talking cholinergic stuff, but just FYI, there's an alpha receptor here, smooth muscle, that can cause the iris to move towards the cornea. The physical space between the two tips, between the two iris tips, the physical space is the pupil. The pupil is nothing more than a physical space between the tips of the iris. As you know, your pupil could be tiny or your pupil could dilate. Right? And so how can we achieve that? Well, the way that the pupil dilates is when the iris starts to lean closer to the cornea. Imagine this leaning forward. Right? The tip goes further away. The tip goes further away, and the pupil gets dilated. Yes? Right? So when the pupil dilates, the iris is laying closer to the cornea. And if you notice, there's actually an angle that we can kind of form between the iris and the cornea. So if the angle becomes narrow, the pupil becomes big. Right? If the angle opens up wide, the pupil becomes small. And so the angle has a physiologic relevance because of the fluid. So do you see I drew these little tiny droplets here? These are little tiny droplets of fluid. The tiny droplets are called aqueous humor. Aqueous means watery. Humor is an old Greek word for fluid. A watery fluid. And the watery fluid gets released or synthesized by the ciliary epithelium. The ciliary epithelium are under beta receptor control. So when beta receptors on the ciliary epithelial cells get stimulated, they make aqueous humor. So let's talk about the ciliary thing. So ciliary is the name of the muscle at the base of the iris. So there's a muscle there called the ciliary muscle. When the muscle contracts, the iris moves away from the cornea, the angle opens up, the pupil gets small. When the ciliary muscle contracts, the iris moves away from the cornea, the pupil gets small. The angle gets bigger. The ciliary muscle is under control of the muscarinic 3 receptor, M3 receptor. So what does pilocarpine, a mostly muscarinic drug, do to the ciliary muscle? Causes it to contract, which means that it pulls the iris away from the cornea. The angle gets big. Okay? Now, the ciliary muscle is kind of shrouded with a ciliary epithelial cell layer around it. The ciliary epithelial cells are around the ciliary muscle. And the two together form the ciliary body. So the ciliary body refers to not just the muscle, but the epithelial cells around the muscle. The muscle can contract and move the iris away. The ciliary epithelial cells make fluid. The muscle contracts when muscarinic receptor is stimulated. The fluid gets made when what receptor is stimulated? Beta receptor. Right? Now, obviously the iris can move closer to the cornea or pull itself back. Can it keep going all the way back, like in a completely 180-degree angle? No. Right? It's bound by these structures of the lens and other things. And there's also fluid filling this area, called aqueous humor. What would happen if the fluid production just happened and there was no way to release fluid from the eye? What would happen if you could only make aqueous humor but you couldn't get rid of aqueous humor? What would eventually happen? The eye would pop. The pressure would get so high. The fluid would go everywhere. It would push up on the lens. It would push up on the retina. It would be really bad. So there is a dynamic relationship between production of aqueous humor and outflow of aqueous humor from the eye. And when the two are balanced, we have a pressure which would be considered a normal pressure. But when something gets out of whack, when either there's too much fluid being made or not enough being cleared, we have an elevation in intraocular pressure. That's what glaucoma is. Glaucoma is an elevation in intraocular pressure. And when the pressure in the eye goes up, the fluid starts to push against the structures. One of those structures is not drawn here, the retina. And so if you push up on the retina and you injure it physically, what does that do? Is that good for you? Can the retina repair itself? No. So glaucoma puts your patient at risk for what? Blindness. Right? This is why I have to treat glaucoma, because you can be blind if the patient doesn't address the glaucoma because of intraocular pressure elevation. So one way to deal with this is to give pilocarpine to pull the iris away from the cornea and open the angle so that the fluid can drain out. There's a canal here. It's made up of a trabecular meshwork, and I think of it as a sponge. Like a sponge can hold a certain amount of fluid, right? But if you squeeze the sponge, you decongest the sponge, right? And then the sponge can soak up some more fluid. And you can squeeze the sponge again and decongest the sponge, and it can soak up more fluid. Right? So this trabecular meshwork is called the canal of Schlemm. The canal of Schlemm. S-C-H-L-E-M. Schlemm. It sounds like a Mel Brooks movie. The canal of Schlemm. But it's an important canal because it allows drainage. And so if you have elevated intraocular pressure because the angle between the iris and the cornea is narrow, you can open up the angle with a muscarinic agonist and increase the outflow of aqueous fluid. So one type of drug that's used to treat glaucoma will pull the iris away from the cornea and open up the angle. Right? And that's a drug like bethanacol, that's a drug like pilocarpine. But what's another drug you might use instead of those drugs? And its effect would be to reduce aqueous humor production. That's made by what receptor being stimulated? Beta receptor. So what kind of drug might you use to prevent its production? A beta blocker, right? So have any of you seen things like, beta blockers end in the suffix OLOL, olol. Have you seen things like timolol? Right, for glaucoma, like as an eye drop, perhaps. Right? So it's going to block those beta receptors from making more aqueous humor, so intraocular pressure goes down. There's other ways to treat glaucoma. One way would be to cause decongestion of the canal of Schlemm by using an alpha agonist like epinephrine. Sweet. Another way to decongest the canal, the trabecular meshwork, is to use a prostaglandin analog like, have any of you seen latanoprost, new forms of latanoprost for glaucoma, it causes contraction of smooth muscle of the trabecular meshwork. Decongest the eye. Okay? So somebody may say, so you can treat glaucoma with various drugs. I'm not here to talk to you about glaucoma per se as a whole disease state, but rather talk to you about the role of a cholinomimetic like pilocarpine in this treatment. But what else I want to say about that right now? Latanoprost, epinephrine. There's other types of drugs, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, which can affect aqueous tumor production. And you'll learn about them all when we talk about glaucoma in more detail, drugs and disease. But for the purposes of here, the idea is you have production of fluid, you have outflow. When there's an out of sync, right, when there's a disruption to the normal balance, and either the fluid accumulates because the outflow is obstructed, you can open the angle. If the angle's already open, though, then you can use beta blockers. You can prevent more production of fluid. One last thing I can tell you about the iris is that there are alpha receptors here in the tips, which when stimulated cause mydriasis. What does mydriasis mean? Big pupil or small pupil? Big pupil, big dark pupil. There's two ways to get mydriasis. One way is to block the muscarinic receptor in the ciliary body. Right? So you don't get contraction, you don't get tiny pupils. Another way is to stimulate these alpha receptors at the ends of the iris. And those receptors are on a muscle, and here's the name of the muscle. It's a cool name. It's called the pupillary dilator muscle. It dilates the pupil. But there's really two ways to dilate the pupil. One is to stimulate that muscle receptor, that alpha receptor. Or you can just block muscarinic receptor in the pupil. So can you name a muscarinic receptor blocker that causes big pupils? I'll give you a hint. Also known as this term, belladonna alcohol. It comes from a plant called the belladonna plant. What does belladonna mean in Italian? Bella, beautiful donna, woman, beautiful woman plant. The beautiful woman plant, the belladonna plant. It's also known as the deadly nightshade plant. So be careful with it. Deadly nightshade and the belladonna are the same plant. But anyway, okay, I'll say that for chapter 8. But maybe we shouldn't block before we stimulate. Okay, sorry. Okay, so it's called atropine. Atropine is the name of the drug. All right, so back to these drugs. So the indirectly acting cholinergic agonists, they work as a class to block the hydrolysis of acetylcholine by acetylcholinesterase. And some of these compounds have a secondary activity at nicotinic receptor. So some of them block cholinesterase and stimulate the nicotinic receptor. So I'll tell you about one of them in a moment. And as a class, these indirectly acting cholinergic agonists are mostly used as insecticides. There's a few that have therapeutic use. And pharmacodynamically, they're all going to be mechanistically similar, and where they'll differ is in terms of their pharmacokinetics. So the first of these are the reversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And they come in two pharmacokinetic classes, the short-acting edrophonium, or the longer-acting stigmines, pyridostigmine, neostigmine, physostigmine. These are longer-acting but reversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Now, edrophonium has a duration of action of about 15 minutes. And it's only used in diagnostic testing to test for a disease called myasthenia gravis. Have you ever heard of that disease? It's believed to be an autoimmune disease that destroys your nicotinic muscle receptors. So all of a sudden, your muscles don't have nicotinic receptors on them. So is it easy to lift and contract, or is it hard? Very hard. So you could usually lift that box of groceries, but now you're barely able to lift it. Right? It's a disease of muscle weakness. It needs to be autoimmune, and it needs to be rare, which is good. But edrophonium is a drug that inhibits acetylcholinesterase. And so if you go into the doctor's office and he gives you a shot or a burst of edrophonium, and all of a sudden you can pick up the box, and you can pick it up for 15 minutes, and as soon as the drug wears off, you can't pick up the box. It's a sign you have myasthenia gravis. All right, so that's the shortest acting of them all here. The longer acting, the stigmines, they basically last anywhere from 6 to 24 hours, depending on the drug. But they also are reversible. Now, irreversible members of the class are the organophosphates. And the organophosphates typically form a covalent bond with the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. And that happens through a phosphorylation of the enzyme. But this is a unique phosphorylation that takes time. It's a phosphorylation that takes time. And so we have actually a time process called aging, after which the bond becomes permanent. So this is kind of a different covalent bond than we've ever talked about. It's a bond that starts out not covalent, it becomes covalent due to metabolism. And once it becomes covalent, it's locked. And you can't get rid of it. Okay? So this process is called aging, the aging process. If we look at the chemical groups associated with the indirect acting compounds, with the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, we'll see some that are quaternary nitrogens, some that are carbamic acid esters, like neostigmine. They may be quaternary nitrogen or tertiary, like neostigmine. And lastly, we have the organophosphates, which are structurally similar to phosphoric acid. So how does this look? Here I've drawn for you kind of a cartoon representation of an organophosphate. And as you know, phosphate, it's a phosphate with a double bond O and a few R groups hanging off. Usually in the phosphate structure, those are hydroxy groups, right? But here these are R groups of some nature. And sometimes the O is an S. But otherwise, this is how they look. And they come into the active site of the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. And as long as the R groups remain unmodified, this is a reversible process. And so this organophosphate can be taken out of the active site using a chemical antagonist called pralidoxime, also known as 2-PAM. 2-PAM can come up to this compound and pull it away from the receptor. Right? So it doesn't do anything to the receptor, it does something to the ligand of the receptor. It's a chemical antagonist, and I tried to draw that here. I think my arrow is going in the wrong direction, though. I think it should be going this way. So the pralidoxime bound to the organophosphate and the free enzyme. So sometimes 2-PAM or pralidoxime is called an acetylcholinesterase regenerator. It frees the enzyme. But it can only free the enzyme as long as the R groups have not been oxidized through metabolism. And so if this has happened, right, if the R groups have been modified due to metabolism or oxidation, this becomes a permanent and a covalent bond. And we say that that is an aging process. Once the bond has aged, 2-PAM cannot recover. You can't regenerate it. So the aging process is something like 2 to 8 hours in most people. And so this becomes important because of something I'll talk about in a moment. So do you understand how this is kind of a unique covalent interactor? It's covalent after a certain window of time has gone by. And so after that window of time has gone by, pralidoxime isn't going to fix the problem anymore. So if we were to look at some of these compounds, We look, for example, neostigmine. Right, this is a compound which is a reversible organophosphate inhibitor that looks a little bit like acetylcholine over here. It's got a quaternary nitrogen, and so it's not as able to penetrate the body as physostigmine is, which is a neutral compound and better absorbed. Now, neostigmine also has some nicotinic activating activity. So not only does it inhibit cholinesterase, but it can also activate the nicotinic receptor. Edrophonium is the shortest acting of them all. And remember, this is used in diagnostic testing. Now, if we look at the irreversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, we see that they contain this organophosphate structure. So our P double bond O, our OR group, our substitution, our P double bond O, OR group, OR group. Okay? Our P double bond O, OR group, OR group. This is ecothiopate. And this is the only organophosphate with a clinical indication. Ecothiopate is a drug used to treat glaucoma. And so how does that work? It inhibits acetylcholinesterase in the eye. So what happens to levels of acetylcholine in the eye? They go up. And what happens to M3 receptor in the eye? It's stimulated. And what happens to the angle between the iris and the cornea? It gets bigger. So what happens to outflow of aqueous humor? It's increased. What happens to your pupil? Tiny. If this is a covalently modifying drug, what do you think about it in terms of its duration of action? Long-acting, short-acting? Long-acting. The only one available as a drug, ecothiopate. These others, like parathione and malathione, are insecticides. Now, we live in 2015, and we don't usually see farms around here. But you go back 50 years, and Long Island was lots of farms, and upstate was lots of farms, and people put pesticides on their crops to increase their yield. One of the commonly applied pesticides of the day was parathione. Parathione is an organophosphate. It's a sulfur analog, so it's called thio. Malathione is a sulfur analog. But this thing inhibits acetylcholinesterase in insects. And if you inhibit acetylcholinesterase in insects, insects have a lot of acetylcholine in their flesh. And eventually, a lot of acetylcholine at nicotinic receptor causes the receptor to be paralyzed, and the insect dies. Right? So parathione is a great insecticide. It kills lots of insects, but it also can hurt us because we have the same enzymes. Same kinds of things happen in us. So parathione was banned in the United States probably about a decade ago. Maybe it's a little bit more or a little bit less, but relatively recently. Why? Because we had migrant workers coming into this country spraying crops out in California and different parts of the country, wearing flip-flops, wearing no masks, wearing no long shirts, wearing no pants, spraying this stuff. And this stuff is highly hydrophobic. You can absorb it across your skin. And so they were ending up in the emergency room. Some of them passed out, right? Some of them salivating like mad, some of them having diarrhea, some of them vomiting. Heart rate, very low because acetylcholine is high in the synapse. And parathione is working well. That's how it kills the insect. Right? So parathione got banned in the U.S., but it's still used in certain other countries. So, Costa Rica, Chile, Ecuador, all those places where we get our fruits from, they use parathione.
Is it getting absorbed?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I know certain insecticides do get absorbed into the vegetables. I don't know about this. So I'll see if I can find out. Probably studies been done on it. I know, for example, that related compounds, chlorpyrifos, which replace parathione, does absorb into the fruit. And, like we have this free lunch program in a lot of the public schools. So a bunch of scientists about 5 years ago did a study on kids, and found chlorpyrifos in the fat tissue. Like it accumulates in the tissue, it doesn't get utilized, it doesn't seem to be toxic, but it's there. So that one stayed in the line of the apple. That's a good question. Now, malathion is one we see a lot, right? So malathion is actually used to control the mosquito population to prevent the spread of West Nile virus. Now, West Nile virus is kind of one of these things. We don't exactly know what long-term health consequence is. Right? It's kind of been around for a few years. It seems to cause encephalitis in old people sometimes, not in all old people, but some of them. So there's some concern that this West Nile virus might cause pathology, and so the public health effort in New York City is to try to control the mosquito population. And it's not just New York, it's upstate, it's not just the city, it's upstate, it's Long Island, it's New Jersey. There are mosquito control methods put into place to try to control the mosquito population. And so one night when I still lived in Queens, I came home from visiting my parents in New Jersey. It must have been like 2 in the morning, and I was living in Richmond Hill, and I walk out of my car, and there's like drops of liquid floating down from the sky, but there's no clouds anywhere, right? And it smells. What is it? So I'm looking, and there's like a helicopter flying around, spraying down there. So I was curious what this was, and I felt bad for my neighbors. He used to hang his clothes on the clothesline, and holy shit. So I found out it was malathion, and it was part of the city's method to control mosquito population, right? And I lived in South Richmond Hill, kind of down there by Ozone Park, JFK, a lot of like marshy and late at night. But so the good news is, this is organophosphate, so it might be like, oh my gosh, that's bad. But we actually metabolize this before it can age. And so it doesn't hurt us. But unfortunately, the insect can't. Well, more fortunately, it depends which view you're taking. So the insect is unable to detoxify it, but so too is the fish. The fish are unable to detoxify it. So when they first started spraying malathion around the 5 boroughs, it ended up bleaching into the Hudson River and into the Long Island Sound, and we started to see fish kills due to malathion contamination. And so the fishermen out on Long Island all got angry because that's their livelihood, fish. And so the city's kind of rearranged how it does it. It doesn't do as much by the coastal areas and stuff, so to reduce the fish. But fish are actually susceptible to malathion, as are insects. But humans and birds are resistant to it because we metabolize it so that it can't become aged.
Is the issue that they can metabolize or they can't metabolize enough?
Alan, you're getting me today with these hard questions. I don't know. I don't know the answer. It could be either, but that is a good question. My feeling is it's probably a kinetics problem more than a deficiency problem, but that's just the total guess. So, but that's the questions. I got to find out these answers. So the arrows here are just pointing to you to the regions that are metabolized in mammals and birds, and so this thing never is allowed to age in our synapse. Okay. Now, kind of summarizing what we've said about these organophosphates. So their typical use is as insecticides, right? So we see malathion a lot around here, but there are lots of other organophosphates used as insecticides. Some of them are used in glaucoma, really one of them, and that's ecothiopate. Some of them are used as diagnostic tests for myasthenia gravis, and that's heterophonium. And this is misspelled. This should have an A, myasthenia gravis. Now, as we look down the list of some of these organophosphates, there are some here that can cause some great concern. Of course, malathion is one that we consider to be generally safe. Ecothiopate is a drug, so it has a therapeutic use. Chlorpyrifos is now kind of taken over where parathion left off. It's become a very abundant pesticide around the country, used in lots of products, lots of foods. Limited non-residential settings, but anyway, it's around. But if we now look back up this list, we see some really bad stuff here. Um, toxic nerve gas, things like tabrin and sarin and insomnia. And so these things are very, very, very potent. So to give you an example, 1 gram of sarin, 1 gram would be enough to poison the water supply of Orlando. Okay? So this is so potent. Usually people who work with it are military personnel, right? And some of these have been developed as chemical warfare agents with the hope of probably serving as deterrent more than anything else. I mean, some of you may know that the 20th century was the bloodiest human century on record. We had World War I, we had World War II, we had lots of conflicts, but those were two huge conflicts. And World War I saw the use of chemical weapons as a normal method of warfare. So you saw the Axis using things like chlorine gas and mustard gas against the Allies, and you saw the Allies using things like chlorine gas and mustard gas back against the Axis. And that was not really yet, we didn't have the Geneva Convention because World War I was before the Geneva Convention, and the Geneva Convention gathered many countries together and said, hey, we really don't want to work with these chemical warfare agents because these are nasty things that hurt people and are not fair. A lot of civilians died. So in World War I, 9 million military personnel died, and 7 million civilians died, almost as many. Right? I mean, it's ridiculously large numbers of people being injured by these things. And so it seemed like Geneva Convention was a good thing. World War II, there was no formal use of chemical warfare agent on the battlefield, although we know what happened in the concentration camps and the use of chemicals to kill people in concentration camps. So we still had chemical warfare, just wasn't maybe on the battlefield per se. And so this led to a lot of discussion over the years, and eventually in the 1990s there was a chemical warfare convention that was held at the United Nations. And they brokered a treaty called the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1997. And so about 98% of the nations on Earth have signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, which means that they will no longer produce chemical weapons and will start to destroy stockpiles because this is something humanity doesn't want. And so there's an office at the UN called the Office for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And they probably always look for interns and stuff in the summer. It's a pretty big thing. They meet every year. This year they're meeting in Brussels. But anyway, they do a lot of work on this because there's still a couple countries who refuse to sign. So let me list them for you. Egypt, Syria, North Korea, Iran, Libya, Iraq. There's a few countries. Israel. Israel signed it, but their parliament never ratified it. It's not officially under the agreement. And so there's a lot of these places, and now probably estimated to be 100 tons of nerve agent in various countries stockpiled as weapons. And so you may have heard that even very recently there was use of sarin nerve agent in Syria. Have you heard that? 2013, there was evidence that sarin was used by the Syrian government. Well, no, I don't want to say that for sure. Somebody used it. The United Nations doesn't exactly know who used it. Assad, very shortly after, when they were threatening, President Obama was starting to go in and blow up, finally signed chemical weapons convention and gave up that scared. He saw what happened to Saddam. Saddam actually was the other one who used chemical weapons up. 1987, he attacked the Kurd village and gassed them with mustard gas. And if you ever go on the UN website, if you ever type in the Fires Project, you can see survivor stories that were gassed, where they are today. A lot of them got refugee status, surgery, health. It's all awful. So let's go back to 1995. 1995, 20 years ago last month, there was a subway attack in Tokyo where a bunch of radical extremists made a lot of sarin. when they eventually found the compound where they made this stuff, they had 1 liter of sarin that they had synthesized. Remember, 1 gram is enough to kill the whole city of Atlanta. 1 liter is 1,000 packs. So basically what they did is they diluted the stuff, put it into a plastic bag, and at 5 o'clock on Monday night, when everybody's going home from work, they came onto the subway with the bag down on the floor. They popped a hole in it with an umbrella on the top shelf. They walked off the subway, all during the changeover. And the bag released the contents of sarin into the subway. Now, sarin is an inert gas agent, it's an organophosphate, but its effects don't really start to be felt for about 2 to 3 hours. So people got exposed, it's colorless, it's odorless, they didn't smell it. And about 2 to 3 hours later, they end up feeling really sick. All signs of excess acetylcholine. They're salivating, they're vomiting, some of them are having uncontrollable diarrhea, some of them are passing out, going unconscious, bradycardia. You're also getting effects on the nicotinic receptors being depolarizing blockade. People stop breathing, respiratory rest, diaphragm stops contracting. Horrible. So these people start ending up in emergency rooms across the areas of Tokyo. They didn't all show up in New York Presbyterian all together, right? So by the end of the night, about 6,000 people had come to emergency rooms around Tokyo with varying symptoms. Some of them died because they were very close to the exposure and that explosive spot. Some of them were much farther away, so maybe they recovered. But by the end of the day, 6,000 people had been injured, 13 people died, and hundreds of people have like irreversible toxicity due to the exposure. So this group, they were called AUM Shirinikyo. They had some issue with the government about something. They were very angry. But these were not like amateurs. Some of them had doctorate degrees from UCLA in organic synthesis. And they were back in Japan. They were highly evolved labs. They worked in a garage, making highly toxic things. And so nobody really knew what was going on that night, but if you go on Huffington Post and type in sarin subway attack, they just did a huge article on it. They show pictures and talk about it and response. But what was a very important part of the response was it's interesting. There was one physician in one of the emergency rooms who had come from a very rural part of Japan where farming was a normal kind of thing done. And he had seen, as a young doctor, he had seen patients who had been exposed to organophosphate pesticides due to overexposure during application. And he said, these symptoms look like what I saw when I was working back at my home, with people who got intoxicated by pesticides. It looked like pesticide poisoning. And so he made that information known to other hospitals, and the hospitals were able to respond. And they were able to give what? Pralidoxine, which is the acetylcholinesterase reactivator, as well as another drug which blocks muscarinic excess called atropine. So there's a 2-drug approach to treating insecticide poisoning. Pralidoxine plus atropine. So shortly after this attack happened in Tokyo, we had the Giuliani administration kind of have a hyper response, because 2 years before the Tokyo attack, there was the first World Trade Center attack, which you may not remember. You may remember, but the guy drives into the parking garage in World Trade Center with a van filled with explosives and tries to explode it. Wow, I don't remember that. That was around 1992 or something like that, 1993. And a couple people died, a lot of people died. In fact, their names are on the wall as well. It's horrible. If you ever get a chance to go, you should go. Be prepared to be totally speechless. What else can you do? But anyway, so the Giuliani administration responded by stockpiling atropine in hospitals around New York City, because God forbid it ever happened. And then 9/11 happened, and so now we realize that there are people who just want to kill for the sake of killing, which is not something we're very familiar with, perhaps, if we've grown up here. And so we need to protect. And so I'll end on this slide, but just so you know the signs of insecticide poisoning, organophosphate poisoning, there's a few. There's the muscarinic excess, the meiosis, the salivation, the sweating, the bronchial secretion and constriction, hard to breathe, vomiting, diarrhea. Then there are CNS effects that actually acting in the brain, in the central nervous system. Anything from agitation to convulsions to coma to respiratory arrest. And then we have the peripheral effects of skeletal nicotinic receptors. So, in short, a person can die because they can't breathe. Their airways are obstructed, they're having bronchospasms, their diaphragm is paralyzed, their CNS respiratory center is turned off, and they can basically die from asphyxiation. Okay, again, this is very treatable with Sucam and atropine, but as long as the enzyme hasn't aged. If the enzyme age, then it's out of your hands. You're either going to survive or you're not. Okay? So with that, we end our discussion on cholinomimetics, and on Tuesday we will have maybe a 20-minute discussion on antimuscarinic drugs, and move right into some pathomimetics. So we're moving along, so try to keep on track. I don't think I'll give you a quiz on Tuesday, so have we had 3 quizzes?
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be it. That sound good? We're gonna have one. Yeah, we'll have one more. That might happen on Tuesday. Yeah.
Is that going to be on everything you've done so far?
Yeah. So have a good day, everybody.